Hi there, and welcome. I'm Thomas Canavan, the Chief Operating Officer of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund and the Executive Director of the National Law Enforcement Museum. I'm so glad that you're joining us for this special five-part series, Law Enforcement Think Tanks Shaping the Future of Policing. In these episodes, we'll hear from incredible leaders working behind the scenes to improve law enforcement in ways that we don't often hear about. For many of us, it might seem like policing has always been the way that it is today, but that's far from the truth. What we learn in movies, TV shows, music, and the media rarely captures the full picture. In reality, dozens of organizations led by law enforcement, policy, criminal justice, and public safety experts are constantly shaping and improving the profession. In this series, we'll introduce you to five of these organizations and the leaders behind them. Chris Hsiung, Executive Director of the Curve, Paul Goldenberg, Senior Fellow at the Miller Center for Policing and Community Resilience at Rutgers University, Ben Heyman, Executive Director of the Center for Public Safety and Justice at the University of Virginia, Jim Bierman, founder of the Future Policing Institute, and Rosa Brooks, co-director of the Center on Innovations and Community Safety at Georgetown University. Each guest brings a unique perspective and decades of experience. Their stories will challenge assumptions, spark new ideas, and highlight the work being done to keep communities safe. Each of our guests' bios and links to their organizations can be found in the episode descriptions. Also, we recorded one introduction for the whole series, so when you start the next episode, you can skip directly to where our conversation begins. Thank you again for joining us today and enjoy the conversations. Okay, well, thank you, Chris, for being with us today. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
It's always an honor. Good to see you again.
So, we're gonna touch on a bunch of different topics today, leading up to your role at the Curve. But I wanted to start with a little bit of background on your education, where you grew up, just for listeners to get to know you a little bit.
Well, great. Thanks. So I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, kind of a boring backstory. I didn't move around much. Since I was the age of like 8 or 9, I think I wanted to be a cop. I went through all of the different iterations that typical parents, especially Asian parents, pushed me to into, and that was like, hey, you need to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. I kind of tried to look into that in the high school years, and I just could not. Couldn't gravitate towards it. At the end of the day, I didn't want to end up in an office working all day, which is really funny because toward the back half of my career, that's all I did was sit in an office. But I caught the bug as a police explorer for the Foster City Police Department, and that's a suburb here in the Bay Area. And that was what, age 15. And from that point on, I think everything I did educationally was with the goal in mind of becoming a police officer. So I went off to San Jose State, grabbed a degree real quick. In hindsight, I probably should have done something more applicable, but I got a degree in sociology. So I guess you could say that that's pretty close to a lot of the work that we do in the career. And then I went off and got hired by the Mountain View Police Department, where I spent 28 years there. And in the middle there, I did grab a master's degree in e-business management, which was interesting because we're right in the backyard of Silicon Valley. So it was a time where the valley was booming, and Mountain View was located right in the heart of that. And to kind of have that intersection of technology with policing and police tech and everything, it was a really neat time to kind of grow up in the industry.
What drew you to Mountain View?
I think at that time I had put my application in all over. It was one of those times where hiring was a little on the slower side. So I had actually wanted to work in my hometown, but they just weren't hiring at the time. And so I had a friend who had lateraled from Foster City to Mountain View. And so I'm like, hey, I'll go do a ride along with you. I don't know anything about Mountain View. And it was a blast. It was a medium-sized agency. And so they picked me up, and I guess you could say the rest is history.
So at Mountain View, you did you hold every rank within that department, or how did you went from rookie all the way to
Mhm.
chief, right?
Yeah, real fortunate. It's Mountain View's about 96 sworn, so medium sized. I was fortunate to just get to move all over the place, pretty much doing most assignments, most all the ranks, as you mentioned. And being lucky enough to kind of come back into some of my favorite assignments like detectives and SWAT by virtue of the guy in front of me promoting. So there was always a spot for me as a supervisor, as a lieutenant, to stay kind of connected to those specialties.
Hmm. And did that progression have a role in your leadership philosophy? How did being able to see each of those positions support that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we're in our early part of our careers, it's all about action. We love going to the calls, the adrenaline, everything. And um, I think my leadership journey doesn't really begin until I'm, obviously testing to be a sergeant. And then once you become a lieutenant, you start to kind of figure out, well, what's my style? What's my communication style? And who am I, right? And I'll be honest, it wasn't until I was, I think, a second year as a captain that I really kind of settled in and go, okay, I think I know my voice as a leader. And um, to your point, it was because the leaders before me had put me in assignments, sometimes kicking and screaming. I remember being sent to internal affairs. Like no one likes going to internal affairs, but it's just so helpful for your career to kind of get that experience under your belt. And then I got sent as a young lieutenant to the administrative role. I'm dealing with everything from alarm permits to feral cats, and you're just like, this is not what I signed up for.
Mm-mm.
But what ends up happening is you really broaden your experience. And so as you move through each rank, there's a certain tipping point, I think, when you're a lieutenant, captain, deputy chief, where it stops being about what you know. It starts being about understanding your own blind spots and the partnerships that you can form with people not only in your agency, but just all the stakeholders in your community, the nonprofits. And it begins to be about relationships because you can't do it all and you can't know it all. And so the leader who understands that really starts to kind of um, be a lot more effective because you grow up in an environment where as a patrol officer, as a sergeant, you can pretty much handle anything coming at you because all the tools are right there on your team. But as you go and grow through the ranks, um, the situations and the problems become way more complex, and they take weeks, if not months or years, to solve. And so it's that kind of evolution that I've figured out, thankfully to many mentors ahead of me and who have prepped me to give me that experience to successfully navigate those types of challenges.
Yeah, I was going to ask how you developed your particular communication style and what is that style?
It's I've always believed wholeheartedly in servant-minded leadership. That's kind of the basis of I'm no better than the people that I lead. And in fact, the more that I move up in rank, the higher the responsibility I have to serve those under me and to provide environments for them to thrive. And that was modeled to me by many mentors within Mountain View PD that I grew up with. We had very kind of forward-thinking chiefs, a series of them that set up that environment and allowed for that. And so, I think it was a kind of a change in the industry at the time because when I first got hired, it was a very kind of traditional, old school agency, very rank heavy, very, as a rookie, you're kind of told, go sit in the corner and shut up, don't open your mouth, we're not interested. Um, and so that morphed in my time right as we got a new chief. Uh, and as a young supervisor, I was exposed to his kind of more forward-thinking, modern policing culture, right? And even back then, this has to be about 15 years ago, he put like Simon Sinek's book, Starts with Why, on the sergeant's reading list. And not only that, he kind of ran the agency with some of that in the backdrop. So in many ways, my career has really been a full circle thing,
Right.
now getting to work with Simon, but having that already, those seeds planted so early in my career progression.
Was that change in the department because of the development of Silicon Valley? Was it a, environmental
Mhm.
kind of philosophy that permeated into other aspects of the town?
I think it's all of the above. So we had the kind of the rough history. Like when I first got there, it was rocky in the department because I didn't know it at the time, but they brought in four lieutenants from the outside. And so four of the five lieutenants were all from outside. So you can imagine that cultural disruption. And then there was a chief that came in and is just really tense, a lot of labor kind of tension. Um, and that's right on the heels of when I'm starting to think about promoting. And so in comes this guy, his name's Scott Vermeer. He became our chief when he was 34. I mean, can you imagine going into an at-will position as a chief at 34? And he had young kids and everything, but he just thought differently. And, he stayed with us for 12 years. And so I began to promote first as a sergeant under him. And so you can make that argument in many ways. Yeah, there were a lot of those factors internally, but yeah, we're right next door to Google starting off, Netscape, AOL, Silicon Graphics. These were all companies, and these were the people that worked in those companies were our community. They lived in our community. So this kind of startup culture mentality, the mantra of, break things, learn, it's okay to make mistakes. Um, those do creep into the culture of the police department. So we do become, I think, more innovative, more willing to kind of challenge our own assumptions, but also willing to make smaller mistakes so that we don't make the big ones down the road.
Yeah, I was gonna say we in law enforcement you don't have a lot of room to make mistakes, right?
Hmm.
So you have
Hmm.
to approach that carefully, I imagine.
Hmm. Yep, absolutely.
So within that uh, environment, you had both, SWAT tactical experience, but also high tech crimes that were occurring. Talk to us a little bit about kind of balancing those two things.
Yeah, so it's funny because I always used to joke, and your older listeners will laugh at this because remember the old VCRs where the clock would blink and you
Yep.
couldn't,
Yep.
there was a certain class of people who were highly intelligent like me who could program that clock. I mean,
Mhm.
I joke, but it's like I always had this tech side of me. So um, I was a detective first, but then right around that time was when the FBI decided in their San Jose RA to create a high-tech crimes task force. And this to me was like, oh, this is the best of all worlds. This is like I can mesh my tech experience with, policing, right? And I didn't even get it the first go around. Like I was too new of a detective. So you can, I was so excited when I eventually got rotated into that spot and I got to work and watch Silicon Valley grow up and boom right around us. But also, like this, with any sort of big boom and anything, crime comes with it, right? There's always this matching kind of push and pull with crime and high tech crimes. It was just an incredible experience to travel the country and chase down, proprietary rights, chip remarking cases.
Mhm.
In our day when we did a forensic takedown of a computer, it was like 400 megabyte hard drive was a big deal, and that was like a
Mhm.
week or two of work.
Mhm.
I'm really dating myself now, but yeah, I mean, it was just an incredible experience, and I got to also do the flip side of that is we had a collateral SWAT team, and I mean, talk about fun and the training and the camaraderie and the
Mhm.
operations we went on, and not only that, but to be able to promote. Every time I promoted, typically you'd get kick off the team, but it just
Mhm.
worked out that every time I did promote, the guy ahead of me promoted as well. And so there was always a spot for me. So I got to finish my lieutenant years as the tactical commander.
Oh, wow. At what point did you start thinking about law enforcement on a larger scale?
That would probably be in the latter years of my lieutenant rank. Another Silicon Valley thing, it was this kind of intersection of social media with police departments, right? And a lot of police departments had a presence, but most in the country at the time, and this is like 2012, 2013, were using it like a fax machine. They would just blast information out, but there was no like interaction. There was no sense of humor or
Mhm.
humanization of your voice, right? And so
Yeah.
I partnered up with a buddy of mine who was at a next door agency, and we started to give talks on how to do this. And we experimented with just being human, and using it to message critical incidents. And being in Silicon Valley, the community loved it, right? They're all on these devices, they're all on these platforms already. And so when we,
Mhm.
as a police department, would share and interact with them online, this was second nature to this community. And so we began to go on the road show. And I'm not here to say that we invented it at all. I mean, it was popping up all across the country, different agencies being really creative. But we shared a lot on what worked, what didn't. And so I began to just see, watch the entire kind of uh, profession evolve with this huge boom in social media.
What platform was that? What was being used at the time?
Twitter and Facebook, and I think, and as far as we could tell, we might have been the first police agency to create a Twitter account.
Wow.
Um, so, and to start using it that way, and we had the advantage because we could knock on, literally physically go into these headquarters of Facebook, Twitter, Nextdoor, knock on their doors and sit down with their engineers and developers. We did this a lot with Nextdoor and just said, here's what works, here's what we would love to see. And they were very open to hearing that kind of feedback.
Did you get pushback from other kind of circles within law enforcement? I mean, as you guys were doing this and it was kind of
Mhm.
new, not many people were doing it. Were there people who were cautioning you against it, or was
Yeah.
there kind of any specific challenge that you guys were working to
Uh,
overcome?
Absolutely. There was, I think with anything new, especially in our profession, everyone hates change, right? And no, there's very few innovators. I think there's a lot more now, but
Mhm.
sure, we got the eye rolls, we got,
Mhm.
the doubters, the haters. But in the end, I think, and this is where, your leadership journey takes you, is you start to understand that if you surround yourself with people who can keep you in check and can kind of give you the right advice and keep the guardrails on, really innovation is just pushing that needle little by little. Like I remember taking an executive leadership class, and it was a book called Leadership on the Line by Marty Linsky. And I actually got to hear Marty speak at Harvard. And he basically says, leadership is about disappointing people at the rate that they can absorb. And so
Mhm.
that really redefined the way I thought about, innovation and leadership. And what do leaders do? They lead. They have to go first on anything. And that means being the first to apologize, being the first to own something, but also being the first to try something new. And if it doesn't work and it fails, well, that's on the leader. So once I started to settle in and get comfortable with that, it really kind of defined who I saw myself, how I believed in myself, and kind of, I guess, my leadership brand moving forward.
Mhm. And then once you became chief, what was your approach? At that point, it sounds like the leadership development was, incremental as you held different roles within the department. And when you became chief, did you have this kind of realization you get to put it all into practice? Was there kind of a stark difference from, the role you had before to now becoming chief? What was the culture that you were trying to implement?
There's definitely that moment where you're like, holy cow, and the buck really stops here, right? But I think the exciting part of that opportunity is I really felt strongly about modeling vulnerability, modeling what my growth, my continued growth as a leader looked and felt like. So my very first command staff meeting with this team that I'd grown up in Mountain View PD with, I remember telling them, I said, hey, look, I'm not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes. We'll learn together. But what I do know is that the collective experience around the room is such that we can't fail. Like we have some incredibly smart people. And I did that intentionally to want to create an environment where people could raise their hands and disagree, where people could raise their hands and say, yeah, I'm not quite sure, or even like to the extent of like, I'm not doing well. I need to step back. I mean, that to me, a leader is one of the most important responsibilities is to create those safe teams, safe environments, because only then will people innovate, try new things, and not feel like they're going to get humiliated or made fun of. And that, it goes against the typical policing culture, right? Which is more of power, rank, arrogance. I think we all know of the supervisors we worked for in the past that professed to know everything and never admitted their faults and held you to that standard. But the irony is as soon as that supervisor left the room, everyone knew like that guy doesn't, clearly he's insecure, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But for some reason, that persona of a leader uh, is almost like the default persona that we see in most agencies, right? And so, including our own. And I saw those and worked for them, worked with them, and it drove me nuts. So I wanted to use my pulpit as a chief to really push back against that and create a different culture altogether.
Was that, did you find that was happening in other departments? I mean, the ideas that you were putting forward as a chief, did you see that being modeled in other parts of the country? And who were some of the other chiefs that you looked up to that kind of
Mhm.
inspired you in that way?
Right. And this is great because it's like the formation of the curve was where a bunch of these types of chiefs that you're describing found each other virtually first and then eventually in person. And these are like Doug Shoemaker, who was formerly Grand Junction and then Denton, Texas chief. Doreen Jokerst, who was formerly CU Boulder and now in Overland Park, and Jack Colley and Castle Rock. These all become, future friends and leaders and mentors. And, we're all different. We have different styles. But if you were to look at each of our agencies, you would find a good degree of leadership humility, kind of this mantra of, I'm here to create this environment for everyone else to thrive, to be their best versions of themselves. And so, that's where I think that's why the current work that we're doing is so fulfilling and passionate, is because, it's incredible to watch staff in any organization and watch that light bulb go off in their head, and that
Mhm.
light bulb of I can do this, or I have this great idea and now I'm being empowered to chase it down and do it. Imagine what that looks like scaled across every department, across every agency, where it's not no longer about the stress of dealing with admin, or I'm being treated terribly, or this is a toxic environment. Uh, we can't help but think that communities served by these agencies will thrive and benefit from healthy, thriving agencies.
Mhm. So you left Mountain View in what year?
2022 December, I believe.
And then you took a role at the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office.
Mhm. Yes,
So
yes.
tell us a little bit about that transition, why you made it,
Mhm.
and, kind of, yeah, what motivated you, and, how was it different from what you were doing at the city level?
Sure. So, I'd been a couple years in as a chief, and I got a call from a sheriff who just won the election. She ran against the incumbent sheriff in San Mateo County. And I grew up, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, in San Mateo County. So for me, this was a tremendous opportunity in a sense to bookend my career. I started my career at Foster City PD, which is in San Mateo County, and I would get to come back home in a
Mhm.
sense and serve my community where I live, right? And so that really drew to me. And then at the time, the sheriff also said, I really want you to do in the sheriff's office what you did to Mountain View, like
Mhm.
bring this culture of, just this new modern serving culture where we put people first and when we put service above self. And so that was a tremendous opportunity to serve. I basically served as their undersheriff for about a year and a half, and that's the number two position. So it was very different in the sense of moving from the police department world to the sheriff's world, and
Mhm.
opened up my eyes. Tremendous learning experience. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed the time. Like it enjoyed meeting the people. They have a term in the sheriff's office. I don't know if it's held widely across the country, but at least in this one, they told me, one deputy, one riot, right? And that kind of
Mhm.
embodies this, against all odds mentality. A deputy can still handle it, right? And
Mhm.
my hat's off to those still serving. I still keep in touch with many of them, and it's just great to kind of see a different organization and then understand the leadership dynamics that work in one place carry over, and they work
Mhm.
and they can scale to a much larger agency or a much smaller agency.
Mhm. And how much larger was the sheriff's department than Mountain View?
uh, a lot larger. So they had like, I think at the time, almost 400 deputies serving,
Mhm.
a geographical area that basically is everything south of the San Francisco border, right up to the city of Palo Alto. And so it's about 800,000 residents, and the scale of units, they have airplanes, boats, everything,
Sure.
the jails. I got to learn the corrections world, which was really neat because at the time we didn't have an assistant sheriff of corrections. So I took that on as the acting one in addition to the undersheriff duties. So I learned all about corrections. And I can't tell you, like, my leadership style is such that I like to go and roll up my sleeves, take off my rank, and just go on ride-alongs, go learn the jobs that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would take the stars off and go into the jails and just learn from the corrections officers and say, like,
Mm-hmm.
and it was really awkward at first, but I think once they got used to me, I'd go in there and just give them breaks and tell them,
Mm-hmm.
um, hey, I know how to toss a car out on the street. I don't know how to toss a cell. Can you teach me? Right. And to
Yeah.
me, it's a win-win because I learn about their roles and they feel like, and I got these comments where they would tell me, we've never had someone from the executive team come down here
Mm-hmm.
and actually learn. Like every time we got visited in the past, generally it'd be followed by a memo that says we did this wrong or had policy
Right.
violation doing that wrong. But for me, it was about learning because you can't serve people, you can't lead people unless you actually understand their world, right? How are you going to
Mm-hmm.
buy equipment for this unit, that unit, if you don't have some firsthand knowledge from them, feedback from them of what works and what doesn't?
Right. How was it scaling up some of your ideas from Mountain View, then going from, 90
Mhm.
plus people to, 400?
Right.
Was there challenges during that process?
Not so much, because I think at the end of the day, I understood that if you really peel the onion back on leadership, it doesn't matter what sector you're in, what business you're in, it's human dynamics, right? Humans leading humans who actually have to serve and lead other humans. And when you have a real good understanding of how you communicate, how you listen, how you have difficult conversations, how you model behavior, if you're consistent on that and you understand that about yourself, then naturally those around you, those you intersect with, if you're really proficient, have a high, we know this term to be emotional intelligence. If you have that and you treat and lead people in that manner, it's going to work no matter what sector you're in. There's just too many takeaways where, and other examples too. If you treat people poorly, doesn't matter what sector you're in, you're just a bad leader, right? So to me, it wasn't hard to make that stretch to you know carry over those human dynamics, carry over like what I had mentioned before, where, and I said this in our leadership teams at the sheriff's office, I said, my expectation of you all who are captains, lieutenants, sergeants is that you serve the people on your teams, right? And you create the environments for them to thrive. Um, to me, a sergeant who can make more arrests than their deputies is a useless sergeant, right? Because we're not paying you to make more arrests, we're paying you to lead. And
Mm-hmm.
we're paying you to create a patrol team that all of those deputies can be the best versions of themselves. And guess what's going to happen? They're going to make great arrests. They're going to make great cases. They're going to solve crimes. And so, yeah, it was a smooth transition. To me, it was proof of concept, right? That you could take leadership principles anywhere and deploy them, and it'll work.
Mm-hmm. And then where does your role at ICP come in? Was that while you were at Mountain View or
hmm
more
Yeah,
recently?
I think I'd always been involved in ICP since I was a lieutenant and served on various committees. I did a few years on their PIO, Public Information Officer section,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think on their Public Perception, Ethics, and Image Committee, and then and last few years I got moved over and nominated for the Human and Civil Rights. So for the last couple years, I've been chairing that group, which it's great. It's just this kind of, again, it's anytime you can stretch yourself a little bit and get put in an assignment that you don't know all the answers to, but you're surrounded by great people who do. To me, that's my experience on the Human and Civil Rights Committee.
Tell us a little bit about the role of that committee within
Mhm.
IACP. What are some of the projects you guys are working on?
It's just it's a collection of some really experts in the field, right? Who just know. We have civil rights attorneys, we have people who work in the Department of Justice, we have local, state, federal, even international representation, and we teach and write and even put forth resolutions to for IACP to consider putting out. Some of the things we've been working on this past year is just this AI, right? AI is it's here to stay. It's a big topic of discussion for police leaders. But we approach it from a perspective of human and civil rights. Like, what decisions do leaders need to make when they're procuring this AI technology? What do they need to write in their policies to make sure that, the best cases, best practices are followed so that, human rights are not, violated in the process of that.
And is part of that process informed by what law enforcement experienced through the facial recognition technology?
Hmm.
A few years ago, there was a
Hmm.
lot of conversations around how technology was being deployed.
Hmm.
And I imagine that there's parallels between the two.
Absolutely. Personally, some of those companies kind of came up around the Mountain View area, so it's interesting
Yeah, I was
to
going to
to
see if there was a connection between your
Mhm.
experience at Mountain View, just kind of in how you approach some of that technology.
Yeah, because in Mountain View, a lot of times we would have startup companies knock on our door and ask to test out products. And so we would a lot of times enter into those agreements and just kind of not even beta test. I think it's like alpha testing these things. And
Right.
the neat thing is they were very open and receptive to our feedback. So, and I wasn't the only one in Mountain View. We had plenty of quote unquote nerds, right, who became police officers but had backgrounds in data management systems, all sorts of things, programmers, computer science. And so I think it was a great mesh and gave me kind of this view of how a widget in a startup becomes a product, which then becomes, a big thing. I remember Axon came to us before they were like really, really, really big. We tested some of their cameras that were like the size. I mean, they were like this big, and it sat on your belt, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that helps inform it. But, fast forward to where we are today, like the committee I'm on for IACP, like I'm the representative from the human and civil rights, but there's also the other committees that IACP have formed the subcommittee for AI, right? And man, there are some incredibly smart people in the room.
Mhm.
These are chiefs and leaders who just, I mean, on a technical level, really
Mhm.
understand AI. I'm laughing because one of them, I think, is a chief. He's also a pastor, and he gave a talk while solving a Rubik's cube all at the same time. And I'm like, I'm in the wrong room. Like, I don't,
Yeah,
I don't belong
exactly.
here.
Yeah.
So,
um, I think certainly all the episodes that we've recorded for the series up to now, people have mentioned AI. And I suspect that the other episodes that we have not recorded yet, it will come up as well. What are some of the things that you all are talking about just in terms of what law enforcement leaders need to be really aware of, or some of the challenges that we don't know yet, kind of how to solve?
yeah, it's multi-layered because it moves so fast that by the time anyone, and our technology committee understands this, by the time we come out with our white paper on AI best practices, it's already outdated, right?
Right.
And by a few times over. And then you have this instance where, it's this garbage in, garbage out. So if a chief is not careful about understanding how whatever product they're evaluating, like how does it get that data? How does it keep that data sound and clean? And how does it not have it polluted by, and we saw this with facial recognition early on, right? Where at the time we didn't know it, but news reports started to come out where, minorities and African American people in the pool and the data, it was like terrible. Like it would just make associations that should not have been made, right? And
Right.
so, and this happens because tech moves really, really fast. A lot of times, I think experience has shown us, and most chiefs know this, like when you're walking that trade show floor on ICP and you're being approached by all these people selling their things, very rarely is a software product fully baked and ready to go and tested. You're usually getting, version 3.8 and it's, they'll sell it to you and then they got to keep fixing it as they go. And that's just the way Silicon Valley works, right? But now you add that to AI and it's like it's moving so fast. Um, we just have to be super careful, but at the same time, it's kind of here to stay. And the other factor is I think most leaders, hopefully they know this, but maybe they don't, is that most of their officers are already using stuff, right? Like um, ChatGPT to write their police reports, right? And
Mhm.
so, yes, is that potentially a helpful tool? Yes. Is it potentially, if you don't know what you're doing and just are being lazy, can that be a terrible tool? Absolutely, right? So I think it's almost we're at a point now where we have to teach our whole profession how to think about technology and evolving tech, not teach them what this is right now, because as soon as this class is over, it's already outdated, but just how to teach them how to evolve with the technology is a key skill that's just not really talked about a lot.
Yeah, it's almost like they need a kind of set of questions to ask,
Hmm.
regardless of what the technology is,
Right,
right? So
right.
to get in front of it to say, no matter what it is, if you can ask and answer these questions,
Hmm.
there's a greater probability that the data will be secure or privacy will be protected, right?
Yeah. And you have to also mix in like what we did at the sheriff's office. I remember we were looking at some AI products and I kind of raised the flag and said, okay, what's really important is we bring the public along this journey with us. Like
Mm-hmm.
the public needs to learn what it can do and can't do with us.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, and I learned this lesson in Mountain View was um, if you come to the public after you've already done your tests and
Mm-hmm.
everything and you just say, hey, look, trust us, we've tested this. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that's great. I mean, but no, they deserve to kind of get on earlier on that train and learn with you, and raise the questions because if you bring them along the process, when it comes time to actually procure that and use taxpayer funds to buy something, you're going to have a heck of a lot more support as opposed to trust issues or doubt and what you
Mm-hmm.
plan on doing with the tech.
Yeah, and there's probably people within the community that know a lot
Hmm.
more about that tech than
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
And so, yeah, I imagine if you can bring those people with you, they can help. And then they can also kind of be the layer between you and trouble in some cases, and
Hmm.
kind of
Yeah.
verify we went through this process and we learned about this together. And
Hmm.
so that makes a lot of sense. So how do you see law enforcement's role evolving in protecting civil rights outside of AI? What's the committee discussing and working on?
Right now, it's a white paper on best practices, and it is trying to fill that void that I kind of described to you of here are your considerations. Like here's what leaders need to think about. We're trying to walk that line of not coming up with like a checklist that could be easily outdated, but philosophically, like, here's your considerations. If you're gonna test products, if you're gonna procure products, if you're gonna, what policy you should develop around that to ensure that as you're using it, that there are audit checks and that the data remains sound and that, it's protected and all those types of things to think about.
And for anyone listening who doesn't know, and I don't think we've said it, IACP is the International Association of Chiefs of Police.
Mhm.
So when you create that white paper, what's the next step for where that information goes? And do you see the results of that work being implemented within departments? Do you have examples of how that committee has informed and changed law enforcement in some way?
I think it's ongoing through, I mean, the committee is kind of a who's who of the top voices in the industry, and there's a lot of them are actually members of another group called the Future Policing Institute,
Mm-hmm.
um, right? And
Yep,
so you've
which will
probably heard
be
of
one
this.
of our
Yeah. Oh,
episodes.
great.
So, yep, we'll get to
Yeah.
hear all about it from Jim Bierman.
Yeah. So, I think what we see or what I see is the smart ones in the room, and I consider myself one of the more idiots in the room, but just I'm really enjoying my time with them.
Right. Yep.
But
Soak it
uh,
in. Yeah.
yeah, right. They're going to be giving talks, right, at either ICP or at tech
Mm-hmm.
conferences, and I'm just grateful that our profession has people like that, right? That
Mm-hmm.
will continue to educate us and not only on the tech, but how to bridge that to us as leaders in the profession.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just how we consistently will evolve, right? They're going to keep writing the white papers and the journals and articles, and the Future Policing Institute is a great kind of collection of those minds, and I think going to be a huge part of the profession moving forward.
Mm-hmm. What are some ways that police leaders can strengthen relationships with marginalized communities? So thinking about
Mm.
kind of the civil rights side, violations that that may occur in different incidents?
Mhm.
And, does the committee play a role in that?
Um, if you're talking about the Human and Civil Rights Committee, not so much because we don't have much of a mechanism for us to kind of get out into the communities because we're all from different parts of the country and the world. But I think the best practice for everyone is to take a step back and understand this concept of true listening skills, right? Communication skills, and it's interesting because listening skills and communication you would think are being taught in the academy. They're not really. It's true listening skills is perishable, and most of us are really bad at it. And we like to say that, true communication is not just hearing words that are going back and forth. It's actually hearing and understanding the meaning of the words. And so, as it relates to the question you just asked, I think what I see too often across the country is a well-meaning police leader who sits down in a community meeting and then tells the community what they need to hear. But
Hmm.
the community, whatever that pick your concern, they want to feel heard, but the frustration level grows. It doesn't go down, it grows because they're not being heard. And so that's a skill that not only officers and deputies at the line level need to learn, but actually mid-level managers, line supervisors, and especially the leaders at the top need to model that, to sit down, hold space, and not create excuses or talking points. Um, and instead model this kind of behavior where you can sit down in a really uncomfortable, tense meeting, but just make the other side feel heard and actually listen. And that's the beginning blocks of communication.
Hmm. You said listening is perishable, and is it a use it or lose it? It's something that we have to practice.
I think so because I think our default setting, and I'll use a marriage example, is you know it, we just want to explain everything or fix whatever the moment is,
Right.
right? It's if your spouse like slams the fridge shut and goes, "You left the fridge open again." Well, that amount of emotion tied into that action, it's not about the fridge, right? There's
Right.
something else going on. But,
Mhm.
and I'll speak for the guys. I'm like, okay, the little guys are like, well, I didn't leave the fridge closed that time or this time. And
Yeah.
and you're like, dude, you completely just missed the point, right? The
Yeah.
point is, and this is the perishable part, take a minute, step back and go, ooh, it's not about the fridge.
Hmm.
Tell me what's happening. And then
Hmm.
when the tell me what's happening is happening, not trying to fix that, but
Right.
just the key word after that being, okay, tell me more. What
Yeah.
else? Go
Hmm.
on.
Hmm.
And then this cathartic thing happens where, it's just, okay, got it all out. There's growth that comes out of that. There's like progress, right? And let's take that back over the community level. Like we need to do
Hmm.
that a lot
Hmm.
more. Granted, on a lot of calls for service, we might not have the time. I get it.
Hmm.
It's not for every situation, but I guarantee you there's a heck of a lot of situations where we could be doing it, but instead we're just, explaining ourselves and not getting anything done.
Yeah. Well, that segues, I think, well into your experience with coaching
Mhm.
and working with different executive leaders. Talk to us a little bit about your work there and how that began.
It's maybe I see it as a way to pay back the profession. I am where I am now because I had the right mentors and coaches along the way. People who modeled what it meant to be a leader and what it meant to admit fault. So, towards the back half of my career, I got in touch with a lot of different coaches. One of my people I grew up in Mountain View PD with, her name is Jessica Nowoski. She was my deputy chief. She went on to found a executive coaching company
Mm-hmm.
called Athena Leadership. And in our discussions, I could see her passion to be a coach, and that kind of rubbed off a little bit. And then I was exposed to, I met Charlie Solano. I don't know if you've met him yet. He's the
Mm-hmm.
retired chief from Tustin Police Department in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
He started a firm called Chief Leadership, and he goes up and down the state and actually across the country now, kind of coaching leaders at the top, right? And I think the biggest mistake that executives in our profession can make is to think that once they got to the top, they've kind of arrived and they don't need to learn anymore because they know it all.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, a good litmus test is ask any leader, like, hey, how many people do you have in your circle that can tell you that you're wrong or that you need to kind of take a step back? If the answer there is zero, it's like, okay, I know exactly this type of
Right.
leader you are and about to become
Mhm.
because, none of us are perfect and we're constantly learning and growing.
Did you learn anything from that experience that surprised you that you didn't think was as common of an issue or as recurring as it was?
Um, I think it was the awareness of knowing that you need to constantly evolve and that you really need to know your blind spots, right? It's
Hmm.
uncomfortable. No one wants to know or even talk about their blind spots, but that's the role of those coaches and mentors is, whether it's through an assessment test where you do a personality assessment and you kind of understand, because you can't improve yourself unless you know what to work on. And you're not going to know what to work on if someone's not courageous enough or you don't have that relationship that someone can say it. When I took those assessments, the results that would come out would say that I'm very soft spoken,
Hmm.
which is true. And I don't often speak up. In meetings, I'm typically the last to talk because I'm just observing everything.
Hmm.
And what I needed to do was to speak up more and to share my thoughts and opinions. And then there were others, on our team who took the same test and said like they're too loud. They take up too much space and time in a meeting, and they had to work on the opposite of taking
Hmm.
space and observing. So it's the leader's job to kind of create that environment where they go, hey, let's all take this test. Let's all learn together and learn what our strengths and weaknesses are so that we as an executive team can function and learn from each other and move forward even more efficiently.
Hmm. Um, so I'm curious about the officers that are serving under a chief and kind of their response to some of the different types of leadership styles. So you describe a chief who doesn't have anybody around them that can tell them when they're wrong. I suspect that there's going to be a certain type of culture within the officers, right, of that
Mhm.
department when that is present, and a different culture when there's a leader who welcomes that type of criticism and feedback.
Mhm.
What talk a little bit about the differences between what's happening underneath those chiefs in those different situations.
Yeah. It's a great question because it's so true. And I answer it from the perspective of having traveled all over this country and spoken to small, medium, large agencies, both on the police and the sheriff side. And what you see is a leader at the top who is dictatorial, who can't be questioned, generally speaks first in a meeting and leaders who speak first in the meeting kind of bias the decision making process for the rest of the meeting because no one's going to go against them.
Mm-hmm.
And then as it trickles down the chain of command, what you would see is like, let's say that there was some critical incident and it didn't go great. And so there's a debrief. Well, that debrief is going to be really interesting because I'm pretty sure, consistent with the culture that's already been set by that leader, is it's going to be very formal and like, hey, let's, this and that, but it's not like a true breakdown where someone can step up and go, yeah, you know what, that one's on me. I did that.
Mm-hmm.
The opposite side of that is, I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary, like they do this documentary on the Blue Angels.
No, I
When,
haven't seen. I know of
yeah,
it, but
yeah, they do this debrief after every performance and they are brutal on themselves and each
mm-hmm.
other.
I think I
But
heard that part
yeah,
actually. Yeah.
but it works because the culture, it's modeled from the top. It's not done out of malice. It's not done to, make anyone look smaller. It's done for excellence, right? The
Mm-hmm.
leader at the top has said, we do this and we have this culture of analyzing ourselves and being hard on ourselves because our lives are at stake and this is what matters. And for excellence, we have to maintain this edge. And so in those agencies, when you have a leader at the top who's doing that, and let's say it's a critical incident that goes bad and the officers or the deputies are debriefing it, you would often see the team leaders step up first and go, hey, I'm going to own that one because, I didn't hear what this or that. I didn't know this or that. And that's where agencies thrive. So you can even take 100,000 foot level and make this kind of generalization that, high performing, high EQ agencies are going to be less, they're going to be more innovative. They're going to probably be less liability or risk, in terms of things going wrong, or even like, financial payouts for claims and stuff, toxic environments where people are in self-survival mode. They don't want to make mistakes. Like that's really dangerous when you have these team environments where
Mhm.
no one wants to make a mistake. So mediocrity is kind of the standard.
Mhm.
You're going to have mistakes. You're going to have probably more catastrophic type of incident failures. You look at the examples across the country where there's like really bad use of force and stuff like that. To me, I see culture. I see a toxic culture where a sergeant probably promulgated or facilitated that kind of culture. A lieutenant probably turned a blind eye to that environment, and probably a captain, deputy chief, and a chief who either tacitly knew about it or just like kind of like, well, good, we're still getting results, right? And
Mhm.
so, again, everything, all roads go right back up to the top on creating this culture, right? So culture is kind of king as it relates to the whole vibe and what it's like to work in an agency, what it's like to even live in that community. It oftentimes kind of dictates the relationship between the police and the community.
And so I imagine in the situation where the chief is open and has a different relationship with their team, that communities are safer.
Mhm.
Is that safe to say?
Um, it's hard to prove. I can tell you anecdotally, agencies that are more have a chief at the top, as you describe, morale is better. Um, sick leave abuse, toxic kind of stress-related issues are lower. People enjoy being around each other. And so anecdotally, I could tell you that, those officers or deputies in those environments come to work feeling fulfilled. They enjoy doing what they're doing. They like who they work with. And when they're out in the community and interacting with the community, they're probably more of a better version of themselves. And the opposite is true too, right? If you have a toxic work environment where it's retaliatory or people fear, they operate out of fear of an IA or, getting moved out of an assignment, um, that toxicity will show itself up in health and sick leave and morale, overtime, abuse, and all the other host of alcohol, drugs, everything like that. And then guess what that officer or that deputy looks like when they're out in the community? Well, they're definitely not the best version of themselves. They're probably really stressed out, really short, really curt. They're not going to be fun to be around. So, pick your poison, right?
Yeah, I guess I probably shouldn't have said safer. There's a lot of factors
Mhm.
that go into that. But in terms of community relations, and I certainly what you describe, I would imagine that the relationship with the community would be improved.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, building off of your experience working with law enforcement executives around the country and your career in law enforcement, you're now the executive director of the Curve. And let's talk a little bit about how that began, and we can work into some more specifics about what Curve is working towards today.
Sure. So if we dial the clock back to the summer of 2020, I think we all remember it was just crazy, right? Across the country, we saw a lot of communities and activist groups rise up against police departments and sheriff's offices. And so Simon Sinek at the time had already done a lot of work with the military, had done a lot of work with the police departments, and even in his third book, Infinite Game, there's a chapter devoted on the Castle Rock Police Department in Colorado, and that was Chief Jack Cawley. So Simon calls Jack up and says, "Hey, Simon's, he's hearing from his friends who are crying for police reform, but he's also hearing from people he knows in the policing industry about, their struggles and how hard everything is." And I later asked Simon, why'd you start the curve? Like, why, what's feeding this? And he goes, I love impossible problems. And so policing in America is kind of an impossible problem, right? So Simon calls Jack up and says, hey, can you get together some of the more forward-thinking chiefs that you know of, and let's jump on a Zoom together. And this, I knew Simon through, I'm sorry, I knew Jack through IACP. And so, here I am, and this is where my career is now full circle because as I had mentioned earlier, I had to read starts with Y to test for sergeant, right? And so now I'm like, and Jack calls me up and goes, "Hey, I don't know if you know this guy named Simon. You want to go on a Zoom with him?" I'm like, "Dude, this would be awesome."
Mhm.
Right. And so here I am on the Zoom. I think I'm secretly taking pictures of the Zoom grid and sending it to my
Right.
wife. And I'm like, I can't believe this. But what we find out is as we go around the room virtually, we find out that no matter where we were across the country, we all felt the same thing as police leaders. And that was this tremendous amount of stress, pressure, betrayal, um, and felt like we got to do something, but we just don't know what we can do. And that call ends up becoming like a quarterly call. And that quarterly call ends up becoming a retreat that we all meet up in person. And we kind of figure out that the policing culture is needs to evolve, right? And I think if we're really honest about policing culture, we have to admit that Hollywood has more of an influence on our culture than we do ourselves, right? Because
Mhm.
the iconic police American show is a thing. Like it's pick your genre, whatever, but it's got its own. And a lot of times it's like the tail wagging the dog where we behave in ways or our young officers behave in ways because they've seen it on TV or a movie somewhere, right? And it's subconscious, or sometimes it's conscious. Look at Live PD. You can
Mhm.
tell when they're playing it up for the camera and stuff like that. So what's missing are leaders at the top who create their cultures by design, meaning like daily almost like driving it towards a flag planted on the horizon somewhere. Because if you don't have a culture by design, then that means you have a culture by default. And a culture by default means that you just let it happen and you let external
Mhm.
forces just kind of take it. It's passive. It doesn't happen overnight. But a culture by default is just like, a leaf in a river. It just kind of moves and before you know it, it's off course, right?
Mhm.
And so therein begins the creation of the curve where it's like, no, culture is what we really need to harp on. We need to create cultures that are vibrant, cultures that focus on human skills, cultures that focus on modeling vulnerability. And the name of the curve comes from Simon. He does a lot of talks. And if you do a Google search on the term law of diffusion of innovation and
Mhm.
Simon Sinek, you'll see he talks about this bell curve. Every organization has a bell curve, and the front of the curve are your innovators and early adopters. Middle of the curve are your early majority, late majority, and the back of the curve are your laggards. Well, cops generally fall into the middle, right, where they don't want change, but they don't like the way things are, right? And that's kind
Mhm.
of across the country. Um, and so the curve is meant to focus on the early adopters and innovators, the leaders who go, there's got to be more. There's got to be a better way. There's got to be a way that we push the profession forward. And I want to specifically call out, like, we're not here to just like dismantle the way everything's been done. It's almost like a yes and not a
Mhm.
yes but, right? So
Mhm.
on top of all the technical aspects of what we do to train our folks, and we do a pretty good job of, um, defensive tactics, driving, policy, like that's not going away. The curve is not here to say that that's bad. What the
Mhm.
curve is here to say is on top of that, we also need to add in human skills, perishable skills, how to have those difficult conversations, how to model vulnerability as a leader so that that culture is pushed down through your organization.
Mhm.
Because we find that organizations that have better morale and everything like we've talked about. So the curve is now, 3.5, 4 years into it. I slid into the executive director role last September. And so prior to that, we had a slow start, mainly because, as you know, when you have a bunch of chiefs on the board, we have great
Mhm.
ideas, very
Mhm.
little time to execute anything, right? And so when I retired, that gave us one of the time to and energy to really start to advance and formalize this nonprofit. And it's exciting because it's growing. I mean, most across the country have heard of it, and when they hear and learn more about it, they want to learn even more.
Mhm.
And what it does is it also brings in outside leadership concepts from other sectors, especially because Simon and his network, they know so many, so many people, right? And what I found is that there's so much crossover because, like I'd mentioned before, it's human skills, it's human dealings with humans. So
Mhm.
just that's why we can learn from the hospitality industry. That's why we can learn from the medical industry or the educational industry. It's not to say that we have to do everything that they do, but there is certainly things that we can learn on how their human dynamics operate and how we can. I mean, one of the most successful webinars we've had was with an author by the name of Will Gadara. And Will Gadara wrote a book called Unreasonable Hospitality. The book talks about the creation of his restaurant in New York. I think it's called 11 Park Madison. Took it from nothing, not nothing, but just a normal restaurant to the top rated restaurant on the planet. And in that
Mhm.
book, he talks about the human factors of how to lead people who serve people. Well,
Mhm.
what do we do in police departments and sheriff's offices across the
Mhm.
country? We lead people who serve people. And so those dynamics, those leadership struggles and what works and what doesn't can easily be brought over. And when we did that webinar and Simon and Will were just talking back and forth, the feedback I was getting from chiefs across the country was just incredible. They're like, this is what we need. This is exactly, it's
Mhm.
inspiring. We want to learn more and do more.
Mhm. So I want to go back just a little bit and talk about some of the nuts and bolts of the earlier days. So
Mhm.
for anybody who's listening who may not know, who is Simon Sinek?
So Simon, he's written 3 books. One is Starts with Why. The other one is Leaders Eat Last, and his last one was Infinite Game. He's got one of the highest viewed YouTube videos on TED Talks on the planet. Google search him and just watch a couple of videos, and you'll understand that he's just very inspirational. He bills himself as an optimist, right? His company is called the Optimism Company, and so in a world where everything is upside down, high stress, pressure, and just it's just rough, he's like a bright light, right? And so it's exactly what policing needs too, that kind of like alternate kind of way of looking at things, thinking of things. Doesn't mean everything's perfect every day. It just means as leaders we have these certain responsibilities, right? And how do we inspire our people to be the best and to be passionate and enjoy coming to work. And so uh, a lot of what he brings and the people that he knows in his network at the curve we're able to bring that and transition it over. And because the curve, the founding board members are all active chiefs and sheriffs, we're able to very easily translate, what someone over here in the military might say, and then say, well, this is how it applies to us in the policing world.
Mhm. And so Simon is not a law enforcement officer, does not have a
Correct.
background in law enforcement.
Mhm.
Um, was there initial kind of resistance to, somebody from, air quotes, the
Mhm.
outside
Mhm.
coming into law enforcement, more air quotes,
Mhm.
or did he have enough credibility as an author, as somebody who has had success in other areas?
Mhm.
Was that accepted?
I think there was a lot of acceptance already because he had done so much work with the military. He's done a lot of work with Navy SEALs, Delta Force, and then he did a lot of his, I think, undergraduate work with the Massachusetts State Patrol, right? So I think
Hmm.
he embedded himself for like a month or two and just
Hmm.
did ride along. So his background is a lot of research on like organizational dynamics, and so he's very observant on these factors in play. And then I think he's keynoted for IACP at least 3 or 4 times. So he
Hmm.
knows the audience. The audience has a
Hmm.
pretty good sense of who he is, what he's about.
Hmm.
And so, have we had pushback? We've had some, and I think most of the pushback I see is from people who think we're trying to call what we're doing now soft. We're trying to replace,
Hmm.
which we're not. Like this is why I make sure to say it's and on top of that, we want to add
Hmm.
this type of training, right? Because we draw parallels to the academy experience. We hire people based on their broad sense of diverse backgrounds and experiences. But what's the first thing we do in the academy on day one? Academies across this country, they all have to get either their head shaved, they're yelled at, they all have to wear a
Hmm.
suit, and they're basically punished for being individuals, right? That's the
Hmm.
culture we create, and we teach them tactical communication, air quotes, but we don't teach them how to listen, how to talk, how to model vulnerability. And then we put them in FTO programs, which further enculturate them into that agency's culture, but their individuality is kind of stripped away, right? And so what we're saying is, well, look, we hired them because they're good people, right? And let's take advantage of that. And I understand the need for discipline in the academy, 100%. I'm not saying get rid of it. I'm saying on top of that, we have to also add these other skills because do we spend more time in riots because we need that discipline, or do we spend more time on calls with the community where it's just communication would be really handy to have those skills, right? So that's all we're saying.
Mm-hmm. So for that initial call, that you had, was it led by Simon, or was he observing and contributing? How did that initial meeting go? I know it was a few years ago, but
Yeah.
any insight?
No, it was led by Simon, facilitated. I think the best thing that happened was very quickly he created this kind of environment where we could open up and share really deep down our vulnerabilities, insecurities, what's working, what's not, our frustrations as chiefs and sheriffs. And that cleared the path to go, okay, now that we've done that, what's the path forward? Like, how can we inspire and encourage other leaders out there? And so, we're constantly evolving and learning too. Initially, we thought we should only be kind of geared towards the chiefs or sheriffs and their number twos. As we started to put more content out there on YouTube and LinkedIn, we've learned that actually the middle management, lieutenants, sergeants, professional staff love this kind of stuff. Like, one of the highest YouTube videos that we have is one on, what's the role of middle management, that topic.
Mhm.
And so it's encouraging to me because we know how fast things are turning over in the industry. That very quickly this middle management group and the line level supervisors will be our next generation of leaders anyway. So it's
Mhm.
really encouraging.
And tell us a little bit about the retreat. So
Mhm,
you all had what progressed into quarterly, more frequent
mhm,
meetings with this same group, and then
mhm,
you decided to get together in person.
mhm.
What was the kind of structure of that meeting, and what came from it?
2.5 day retreats. We've done four of them now.
Mm,
And we have kind of a core group. Those are the founders, but we've also had people from across the country just come in. Some have dropped off, which is fine, but just different voices and perspectives from agencies large and small. And again, we take a lot of time and energy to make it a safe place, right? And it's not a kumbaya session by any means, but it's just like, hey,
mhm.
let's really talk about the issues, right? And this frustrations we've all learned, in our growing up in our agencies.
Sorry, I was about to sneeze.
I know. I saw
For anybody listening, they didn't see that, but it was a moment. So in terms of, I think you might have touched on it already, but the gap that curve aims to fill in policing, what's that specifically?
um, just providing that missing bit of inspiration, passion, and actually hardcore like skills, human skills too. Like, when we're developing content now to fill that gap, that need on, how do we teach our folks how to have a difficult conversation? Because when we promote people, we send them to the schools that kind of check the box for state mandated regulations, and they teach tactical things or they teach like checklist things, but they don't actually teach, or very few of them teach, how to actually understand your own communication style, how you listen, how you talk, and how you're heard, and then how to do the same with whoever you're having that. So if you're a brand new sergeant having to counsel someone for the first time that happened to be
Mhm,
your beat partner, that's a
mhm,
really awkward, uncomfortable conversation that most of us, myself included, did not have any training for. And then now you're a lieutenant, and now you got a bunch of how do you deal with that corny, or I'm sorry, not corny, ornery sergeant who is just a thorn in your side versus a brand new sergeant who doesn't, these are skills that are skills like but they don't teach that. We don't talk enough about those types of things. So we want to
mhm,
fill that gap. But very often we say that we're not a training company at all. We are a social movement. We're here to try to just inspire people because we know that leaders who are inspired with the right tools will put forth the best things for their agencies, which are for their communities, right? We don't know
mhm,
exactly how Anytown USA is the best fit, but you know who does? The chief or sheriff who sits there.
mhm. Yeah, and I suspect that if you are inspiring those people to learn those skills, they will seek out the
Mhm.
opportunity to do that. So, are those training options available? Do they exist?
They're coming. Right now, they're more in the form of conference speaking opportunities, and we're kind of, because of the scale of interest from across the country as well as Canada. Um, I'm I'm one person right now. You know, the Curve has 1.5 employees, so you're looking at the one, and then we
Right.
have a finance director. But what's to come is that I'm kind of bouncing around at different state association conferences as well as ICP just to get the
Hmm.
word out. But what's coming is development of content, classes, scaling, and really, getting trainers to train the trainer type of thing. So that's kind of what we might expect to see in the next year or two.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about is preparing for each of these conversations and thinking about the impact that these organizations are having, including the Curve and others, is that, and we talked a little bit about scaling up from Mountain View to San Mateo County. How do we scale up what the Curve is doing, what the Future Institute is doing, what the Miller Center is doing to reach 18,000 agencies?
Mhm.
How is that? I mean,
Yeah.
like, how do you go from, you know, what we're doing now to needing to have an impact immediately across
Mhm.
the country?
That would be solved by the law of diffusion of innovation, right?
Yeah.
In each of
Hmm.
those groups that you described, we focus our marketing efforts not on the majority, but on those leaders who are the early adopters and innovators in their spaces. And what will happen time after time, it's been proven by this law of diffusion, is the middle of the curve, the majority will look over their shoulder and go, that seems to be working really well. We need to
Hmm.
start doing more of that. Right. And then
Hmm.
more agencies and more leaders will start. And I've seen this, like when we first started 4 years ago, Simon, I remember him telling me, he goes, hey, when you give your talks at these conferences, and maybe there's 300 people in the room, he goes, my guess is you'll probably have 10 to 15 people at the very end of the talk who come up to the front of the stage and
Hmm.
want to learn more. He goes, that's who we focus on. The people who
Hmm.
walk out the back, no problem. That's good. We try to get them exposed, but we focus on efforts on the small percentage that comes up. Now, fast forward 4 years, that group has actually grown a lot. Like our
Hmm.
LinkedIn Curve page is up to 5,700 people, and that was only started, last year. And
Hmm.
so we have this kind of building momentum of early adopter leaders who are thirsty and want to learn more and understand the profession needs to continue to modernize. And so we'll keep feeding them, the content and the training necessary. I mean, everything right now is free. We don't have a product to sell. Like everything that
Hmm.
I'm describing is on our YouTube channel, it's on our LinkedIn page. And so we're doing what we can to just kind of encourage the profession to continually modernize.
Hmm. Um, so in the law of diffusion, where do we need the most growth, right? In each of those sections. So you have, I forget the name of each of the sections, but you have the innovators right there at the very
Mhm.
beginning, and then you have the second group. Is it in this second group where we need more people pushing out what the innovators are doing? Do we need more innovators? Where do you see the greatest need?
I think it's identifying and getting the word out to the early adopters and innovators, right? And
Hmm.
and what the law of diffusion says is it'll hit a tipping point. Once you have, I think it's 13.5%,
Hmm.
um, a tipping point happens where now it becomes the majority, the early majority, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so, we're not worried of the date that'll happen on. We just know it will.
Hmm.
And so the challenge is, leveraging technology and stuff to get the word out. And that this is why our approach is mainly to, try to hit up the different state associations. So if
Hmm.
any of your listeners are, the directors of those state associations, we're more than willing to come out and talk and just share what it's about, and just kind of uh, encourage them to be thirsty to learn just a little bit more. That's all we're asking.
Hmm. Hmm. One of the things that I read um, is the Curve's goal is to protect the vulnerable from harm.
Hmm.
Is that a Curve goal, or is that a goal for policing? Explain that a little bit.
We focus a lot on language. Language really matters, right? That's why we don't use the term law enforcement, because law enforcement is a portion of what we do. It's a very important portion, but it doesn't define what police officers and deputies across the country do every day. Like in their typical day, they're doing
Mm-hmm.
so much more than just enforcing laws, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so to that end, the phrase protect the purpose of police is to protect the vulnerable from harm. Um, it recenters what the priorities are, right? It's, most value statements or mission statements talk about to protect and serve. Okay, but do people really get behind that, right? But when I tell people, or if I tell officers, your job is to protect the vulnerable. Now that means different things in different situations. If you're in a foot pursuit down an alley, you jump a fence, and now you are in the worst knockdown, drag out fight of your life with a suspect. The second those handcuffs go on, is that suspect vulnerable? Yes. Right. Now, had that phrasing terminology been inculcated into academy defensive tactics training and de-escalation training, could that, and that kind of concept is hammered home, the second someone is vulnerable, I mean, the second someone is in handcuffs or vulnerable, you think that might have, prevented some issues down the road or historically? Absolutely. But there's also other elements of this, right? Our own people can be vulnerable, right? Our job as leaders in policing is to protect our own who have been exposed to crazy amounts of stress and critical incidents and are not doing well. Um, our job as leaders is also to protect them, right? And so it's more of um, a way to kind of take a different perspective of our mission and our goals, right? And so um, this type of language switch is important for leaders at the top to understand that words matter, and what we would love more than anything is that if leaders start to, like what I just described to you this last couple minutes, if they are also broadcasting the same type of priorities down their chains of command. Um, if they indoctrinate, this type of terminology into their arrest control techniques and stuff like that, if it becomes a department mantra, and we've had chiefs. I mean, I just got one this earlier this week where he's like, "Hey, I just designed, we got it." He showed me a picture of his challenge coin that he developed for his team, and it said, "We protect the vulnerable," right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
at the top, he is harping on it in different ways daily, weekly, and just saying, hey, our job is to protect the vulnerable from harm.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that department is like, we're going to hold it up high and say, this is exactly what we're asking for, and it
Mm-hmm.
does change things. And I would say it would guarantee that it would, improve the relationship with the community as well. And here's the other thing: is I've sat down with many activist groups, reform groups, um, the so-called people who want to just kind of change or abolish policing, and I talk about protecting the vulnerable, and for the first time, they're like, this is exactly what we've been asking for. Like they can
Mm-hmm.
get behind this message as well. And this is the power of words.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that's hard to do for um, an officer that, they've been looking for a particular person who, it's been a challenge to capture, has been committing crime after crime, and in some cases is causing serious harm and, death, right? And so
Mhm,
you finally get that person in your
mhm,
custody, and, and then to switch
mhm,
to having to now protect that person
mhm. Yeah,
seems like that's a tall order.
it is. And that's why this job is not for everybody. And that's
Yep.
why, this is why we're called professionals. And it's not just some easy, blue collar job. This is a profession. And
Mm-hmm.
it requires we find the right people, but it also requires that, we meet those standards and the ability to switch it off. Because if you can't, then
Mm-hmm.
you shouldn't be wearing a badge.
Mm-hmm. So with Curve focusing a lot on culture within law enforcement and less on policy, was a specific decision, a direction that you guys decided to go, or is policy something that you think the Curve can influence, and you know, if not, why not?
Um, I think because there's plenty of others in the field that are doing the
Mm-hmm.
policy work, right? What we saw was a lack, a need, and that was a vacuum of inspiration,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's kind of the void that we fill. And so, not to say that policy work is bad or anything. It's needed. I think it's just what's missing in this side of things is the inspiration and kind of the joy of watching someone's light bulb go off in their head and the after effects that that has on a team or an organization.
Mhm. Is there, or I guess, talk a little bit about um, what you are, in large part, the curve, the 1.5 staff for the organization. Um, so aside from speaking engagements, you do a lot of work on social media. Are there convenings, or are there programs that you have or are developing that law enforcement officers can take part in and learn from the curve?
Yeah, we actually have a conference coming up on April 24th. And so that's a 1 day thing where we'll bring in leaders from outside of policing to talk in person. We'll probably be doing more conferences in the future. The best place to get our kind of continued content is on LinkedIn.
Mhm.
And we're redeveloping our website right now. So eventually, when the website's up and running, it'll have a resource library, all free. Like it's just all, videos and articles. Right now on the LinkedIn side, we're putting out articles and blogs like 2 to 3 times a week on a variety of different leadership topics.
Mhm.
And so, give us a follow and you'll get those as well.
What are some of the long-term goals for Kerr? How do you see the organization growing? Have you experienced some challenges forming a nonprofit? And I imagine it's quite different from leading a law enforcement department in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's funny as I actually had this exact conversation with Simon. I said, "Hey, I know how to run a police department. I could probably get dropped into any police department right now and probably do a decent job." I go, "I don't quite have the same skill set for a nonprofit." And he laughed. He goes, "Well, welcome to the world of entrepreneurship." Like he's been there. Like,
Yeah.
basically, it's like I am now in take me out of my comfort zone, and I'm in the new learning phase, and that's fine. And he's been nothing but supportive, and so it's a fun time personally for me to learn and
Yeah.
stretch, right? And to learn the
Yeah.
nonprofit world. What's neat is I've met so many people across the country like you, right, who have different pieces of that puzzle. And
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
meet up, you talk, you have coffee, you Zoom meetings, and you slowly but surely this 5,000 piece jigsaw puzzle gets, filled in. And
Yep.
so um, add to that layer is this tremendous privilege of having a seat on this ride to change and help and modernize and improve policing, right? And this weird kind of part of history that we're in.
Hmm. Yeah. One of the things that, we talked a few months ago, and I was scanning the website, and something that jumped out at me and was the section on the website dedicated to the history of policing.
Mhm.
So where does that fall in Curve's mission? And is that something that you're actively pursuing? What do you think will come from a very comprehensive project
Uh,
such as that?
well, I need to rely on people I know in my network that know history, so that I'm looking at them right now.
Yeah.
um, that goes back to, the importance of any organization knowing their history. If you don't know where you came from, then,
Mhm.
you're not going to know where you're going, right? And so
Mhm.
we take a page from the military branches, like every branch of the military knows the depth of their history. They celebrate their birthdays and everything. And
Mhm.
then, Simon posed this question to us at that retreat. He goes, "How many of you celebrate the birth of policing in America?" I'm like,
Mhm.
well, no one knows the date. There is no date, right? And we don't
Mhm.
know. They don't
Mhm.
really teach too much history in the academies other than, key significant events like the LA riots or, things like that. They're events, but they're not like where we came from. So, it is definitely something I want to kind of try to, find the bright minds in the country like you and to help kind of, you know, write and teach that part of it because I think it becomes a very important part of, I imagine a time where 5 or 10 years from now, we look back and go, yeah, every recruit knows the history of policing in the same way that if you're in the Marine Corps, Army, Air Force, that they know their history of where they
Mhm.
came from.
Mhm. It's interesting. When you said celebrate, that made me realize, like in the military, we celebrate victories, and in law enforcement, we don't celebrate
Mhm.
our victories. And because of what everybody sees and what everybody hears, right, related to law enforcement in the country, it's kind of, law enforcement, I think, celebrates within itself in a way, and they support each other. But as a country, we don't celebrate law enforcement.
Mhm.
And, it'd be interesting on kind of the other side of, what Curve is trying to change in terms of culture within law enforcement. How do we change the culture? And then one may come after the other, right? But changing the way we celebrate law enforcement within the culture of our country and our communities.
Mhm.
And I think that is something that we outside of law enforcement have to be responsible for, right? And
Mhm.
take
Mhm.
responsibility
Mhm.
for. And in that way, right, once we see that we kind of have permission to celebrate,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And I think that would change a lot of things kind of within law enforcement as well.
Mhm. And I think it goes towards, we talked earlier about how Hollywood has more of an influence on our profession than we do
Right.
ourselves. To your point, doing stuff like that is one more thing that takes us farther from that, right? Like,
Mhm.
it just drives, I mean, I guess it drives me crazy, but like, it's also funny, most of us in the profession can point to a TV show that got us hooked into wanting to become a police officer,
Mhm.
right? In
Mhm.
my era, it was Chips and TJ Hooker.
I knew you were going to say chips.
So, right? But
Yeah.
that's a good thing, but it's also like,
Mhm.
wouldn't it be great if we didn't have so much reliance on that? I mean,
Mhm.
it's always going to be a part of our history, but I
Mhm.
would love that we have a new version of that for the future generations to come.
Yeah. Why wasn't your inspiration from an officer in your
Right.
community? Right.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, oh, what was the other thing that I was going to say? It was super profound, I'm sure. um, oh shit. Oh, oh, it was an idea about collecting the history of law enforcement. The part that is complicated, especially here within the United States, is that we have 18,000
Mhm.
agencies, right? And
Mhm.
so, when I saw that on your website, I was like, good luck, Chris. I don't know how you're going to do that. I mean, we don't even, we don't have that here at the National Law Enforcement Museum, right? And
Mhm.
granted,
Mhm.
we're quite young, and hopefully we will one day, but even in terms of the resources that we have here within our collection and the museum, you know, being able to capture the full history of law enforcement in every community since it begun across the entire United States is a massive endeavor. So it leads me to an idea of training or providing a way for departments to write their own history,
Mhm.
and then we aggregate it in some way,
Mhm.
and then using chat gpt we put it
Yeah,
all in
of course. Yeah.
there.
Well,
Right.
it's like those efforts, the oral histories that
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
National Archives collects. I mean, it's like that, right?
Right.
Somehow you collect it and then data mine it.
Yep.
I can already see the booth in your museum where you
Yeah.
type in the prompt that you want to hear from, and boom, it's like,
Right. Right.
yeah.
Yep.
Mm.
So there's a way. We will
Yeah.
figure it
Oh, let's do it.
out. Okay. All right, good. Well, let's end there. This was
Okay.
a great conversation, Chris.
Mhm.
It was a pleasure to hear all about your career and the work of the Curve, and
Mhm.
I'm sure there is much more to come from you and Simon and the extremely awesome advisory board that you guys have put together.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks for the honor of being a part of this.
Absolutely.
We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one on one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. The Icon series is not just about contemporary figures in the law enforcement community, but about all those who have served their communities and the world, from now and in the past. Be sure to tune back in with us for future Icons episodes to learn about key figures in American law enforcement history. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.